Creature in Denmark by Horvath. There was an old fisherman named Lars who lived beside a frozen lake deep within a small forest in Denmark. His cabin sat far away from the closest town, hidden within dark pine trees where almost no cars ever passed. Still, the town was just close enough that Lars could make a long trip to the store when he needed supplies. The cabin was small, warmly lit, and built from old pine wood that creaked whenever the winter wind pushed against it. At night, the yellow glow from the windows looked lonely against the endless snow and darkness surrounding the lake. Years ago, Lars had been strong enough to disappear into the forest for days at a time, surviving alone with only his gear, his gun, and the freezing wilderness around him. But age had weakened him. His knees ached in the cold, and the deep woods no longer felt familiar. They felt distant. Now Lars mostly stayed near the cabin, or on his porch listening to the wind scrape across the frozen lake at night. Sometimes, when the storms were quiet, he thought he heard something beneath the ice. One freezing night, Lars invited a few old friends to his cabin to play whist. Snow drifted heavily through the dark forest, and the wind howled so loudly through the pine trees that it almost sounded human. When his friends arrived, they quickly hurried inside, stamping snow from their boots before shutting the cabin door tightly behind them. Emil was the first to arrive. He had been born in the USA and had fought in the Vietnam War before moving to Denmark many years ago. Even now, there was something tired in his eyes, as though part of him had never truly left the jungles. Mikkel had known Lars since childhood. The two old men had spent most of their lives fishing together on the lake before age and winter slowly trapped them indoors. Nikolai arrived next. Years ago, he and Mikkel had constantly screamed at each other over old arguments nobody even remembered anymore. Now they were too old and exhausted for shouting. They mostly ignored each other in silence. Last came Casper, who worked at a small supply store Lars visited every few weeks. Over the years, the lonely trips into town had slowly turned the two men into friends. Soon, they all sat around an old wooden table, lit only by candles and the weak orange glow from the fireplace. Outside, the endless darkness pressed against the cabin windows, while snow swirled across the frozen lake beyond the trees. The men played cards quietly for hours. But every now and then, Lars noticed something strange. A sound. Not the wind. Not the ice shifting. Something else. Something slow moving beneath the frozen lake outside. At first he said nothing. The others were laughing softly and placing cards onto the table, trying to enjoy the warmth of the cabin while the storm trapped them deep within the forest. Then came another sound. Scrape. Everyone stopped. Casper dropped his card. The candles flickered. A long scratching noise dragged beneath the cabin floorboards from the direction of the lake. Nobody spoke. Emil slowly looked toward the dark window beside the table. For a brief moment, he thought he saw something large moving past the ice outside. Not a man. Something taller. Something with pale blue scales glistening beneath the snow. Lars slowly stood from the table, his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. The scratching sound beneath the cabin had stopped, but somehow that only made the silence worse. Without saying a word, Lars walked toward the corner of the cabin and reached for the old hunting rifle hanging beside the door. His weathered hands shook slightly as he checked the chamber. Mikkel quickly grabbed a flashlight from Lars's old backpack near the fireplace. The weak beam flickered uncertainly, as if the batteries were dying. Caspar nervously picked up the deck of playing cards from the table. He had once been so skilled with cards that he could throw them hard enough to slice fruit during summer festivals in town. Even now, despite his age, his fingers still moved quickly. Nikolai quietly removed his one heavy boot and held it tightly in his hand. Nobody laughed. Outside, the storm had grown strangely quiet. Then came the sound again. Scrap! This time, it came from the frozen lake itself. The candles flickered violently. A loud crack echoed through the night beyond the cabin walls. Lars opened the door. Mikkel come out. Lars was aiming at the lake to think it a bear or a badger. Mikkel slowly turned the flashlight toward the lake. At first he saw only darkness and falling snow. Then the beam caught something standing on the frozen lake. A tall shape. Too tall to be a man. Its pale scaled skin glistened beneath the moonlight, and long clawed fingers hung motionless at its sides. Thin streams of water dripped from its body fat onto the snow. The thing did not move. It simply stared at the cabin with huge black eyes that reflected the candlelight. Nobody inside or on the porch of the cabin breathed. Then the creature tilted its head slightly, almost like it was listening to them. Lars immediately raised the rifle and fired. Bang! The sound exploded through the cabin and echoed across the frozen lake. The creature did not move. Emil instantly ducked beside the table, his old war instincts returning faster than thought. Years in the jungles of the Vietnam War had taught him that fear could kill a man quicker than bullets. He grabbed one of the candles before it tipped over and whispered harshly, "Lars, stop shooting." But Lars fired again. Bang! Bang! The bullet struck the creature's scaled chest, but they seemed to have no effect at all. The thing simply stood there in the snow, staring at the cabin with its huge black eyes. Emil stared at it in disbelief. "I've seen men survive terrible things," he muttered quietly. "But not this." Nikolai let out a frightened gasp before collapsing backward onto the wooden floor with a loud thud. Mikkel stood frozen beside the porch rail, still clutching the flashlight tightly in his shaking hand. The beam pointed directly at the creature, lighting up the steam rising from its wet body. Caspar dropped the deck of cards onto the floor. The cards scattered everywhere like falling leaves. Lars slowly stepped closer to the creature, breathing heavily as he kept firing at the creature through the snow. But nothing happened. The creature kept coming. Mikkel suddenly grabbed the boot from Nikolai's limp hand and hurled it toward the creature in panic. The boot struck the creature across the shoulder. To everyone's surprise, the creature actually stopped. Slowly, it bent down and picked up the boot with its long clawed fingers. For several strange seconds, it simply examined the boot, turning it over carefully as snow blew around its tall body. Almost curious, almost confused. Then it dropped the boot into the snow. Click. Lars pulled the trigger again. Nothing. He was out of bullets. The old fisherman slowly lowered the rifle. His hands trembled as the empty gun slipped from his fingers and crashed onto the snow. Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed. The creature stared at Lars one final time. Then, without warning, it turned and walked silently back toward the frozen lake. The ice cracked loudly beneath its weight. A dark hole opened in the frozen surface, black as endless night. The creature slipped into the freezing water and vanished beneath the ice. The lake became silent again, but deep below them, something was still moving. Lars slowly walked backward from the window, his face pale as snow. "Well, what was that?" he whispered to Mikkel. Mikkel kept staring at the frozen lake. "I don't know." Everyone stood frozen with fear and confusion before slowly moving back toward the center of the cabin. The warm light from the candles no longer felt safe. Casper nervously looked toward the dark window and said quietly, "It might be a nook." Mikkel carefully lifted Nikolai from the floor and carried him toward Lars's small bedroom, laying him gently onto the old bed. From beneath the table, Emil slowly crawled out, still shaken. "What is a nook?" Emil asked. Lars dropped heavily into a chair beside the fireplace and pressed one trembling hand against his forehead. Casper swallowed hard as Emil stepped closer. "A nook is a shape-shifting water spirit," Casper explained quietly. "It lures people into the water and kills them." He slowly pointed toward the frozen lake outside the cabin window. "That might be the thing we just saw." Lars slowly lifted his head toward Casper, his hand still pressed against his forehead. "But the nook hunts women and children," Lars muttered. "We are old men. Why would it want us?" Mikkel returned from the bedroom and stood beside the table. "Well, whatever that thing is," he said nervously, "we have to do something. If Casper is right, we might all die." Emil shook his head immediately. "We should call the police or somebody," he said. "That thing survived bullets. Lars only has camping gear. We are not killing it." The cabin fell silent. Outside, the storm wind screamed through the trees. Finally, Lars stood up slowly. "Well," he sighed tiredly, "everyone go home. We'll deal with this in the morning." Emil, Casper, Mikkel, and Lars carried the unconscious Nikolai through the snow, toward Emil's old truck parked outside the cabin. They carefully placed him in the back seat beneath thick blankets, rolling up another blanket beneath his head like a pillow. Snow blew across the frozen lake behind them. Nobody looked toward the water. As Mikkel closed the truck door, he turned toward Lars. "Do you want to stay at my house tonight?" he asked quietly. "Your cabin is not safe anymore." Lars stared silently at the dark forest surrounding the lake before nodding once. "Yes." He returned inside the cabin one last time to pack a bag. For several long seconds, the cabin door remained open behind him as cold wind drifted through the room. The candles flickered violently, and somewhere far beneath the frozen lake, something moved again. Lars finished packing his bag and slowly walked outside through the snow. The freezing wind pushed against his coat as he climbed into Mikkel's old car. Nearby, Emil drove away first with Nikolai unconscious in the back seat beneath thick blankets. Before leaving, Casper stood beside his own car, nervously rubbing his hands together to stay warm. "You two stay safe tonight," Casper said quietly. "If that thing comes back, call me." Mikkel nodded. Casper gave one last uneasy glance toward the frozen lake before climbing into his car and driving away into the snowy darkness. Mikkel started the engine and slowly drove away from the cabin. as they left the frozen lake behind. Lars turned and looked at his home one last time through the falling snow. The warm lights glowing from the cabin windows looked small and lonely against the endless darkness of the forest. Then the cabin disappeared behind the trees. The drive into town was quiet. Neither man spoke much. Snow slid across the road as Mikkel finally pulled into the driveway of his tiny brick house. Moss grew along parts of the walls, making the house look old and damp from years of cold winters. The two men stepped inside. The house smelled faintly of soup, wood smoke, and old books. Pictures covered the walls. Lars noticed photographs of Mikkel's wife and children smiling during happier years. Some pictures were so old that the colors had begun to fade. As Lars stepped through the doorway, a small cat waddled toward him. "When did you get a kitty?" Lars asked tiredly. Mikkel removed his coat and chuckled softly. "The cat? I found him on my porch one winter night. He was missing a leg." Lars bent down slightly to look at the animal. "Why is he missing one?" Mikkel shrugged. "I don't know why." Lars placed his bag onto an old wooden bench with a faded blue cushion before sinking heavily into a chair in the living room. "I'm going upstairs to get ready for bed," Mikkel said. "Feel free to make yourself at home." Lars nodded silently. As Michael walked upstairs, Lars let out a long, exhausted sigh and leaned back in the chair, staring blankly at the dark window across the room. The cat slowly jumped onto his lap. It was chubby with tiny legs, soft white fur, and a bright red collar with the name Olaf written on it. The little cat purred loudly as Lars gently rubbed behind its ears. For the first time that night, Lars felt slightly calmer, but only slightly. Outside, the wind scraped softly against the windows. Lars carefully lifted Olaf from his lap and stood up. "Good night, Mikkel," he called tiredly. "Good night, Lars," Mikkel shouted back from upstairs. Lars walked into the guest bedroom and slowly climbed into bed. A moment later, Olaf padded quietly into the room and leaped directly onto Lars's chest before curling into a warm ball. Within minutes, Lars finally fell asleep. Outside the house, snow continued falling silently across the empty streets of the dark Danish town. The next morning, Lars woke to the smell of coffee and warm oatmeal drifting through the tiny brick house, while snow fell quietly outside. Olaf was sleeping on his chest. Lars gently scratched the cat behind the ears before slowly sitting up in the guest bed, still thinking about the creature they had seen beside the frozen lake the night before. What was that thing? Olaf rolled onto his back, still half asleep. The cat let out a tiny meowing yawn before trying to climb off the bed. Still tired, Olaf immediately slipped and fell onto the floor with a soft thump. Lars laughed quietly for the first time since the nightmare at the cabin. Then he stood up and walked toward the kitchen. Mikkel was standing near the stove cooking oatmeal while slices of rugbrød sat beside 2 steaming mugs of coffee. "Morning." Lars yawned tiredly. "Mikkel." "Good morning, Lars," Mikkel replied while pouring coffee into a mug. Lars grabbed another mug from one of the cabinets, poured coffee for himself, and sat down at the opposite end of the small square table. "I made rugbrød and oatmeal," said Mikkel. "Thank you, Mikkel." Mikkel smiled faintly before sipping his coffee. For a few moments, the 2 old men sat quietly, while wind brushed softly against the windows. Then, Lars finally spoke. "Should we tell the police about the creature we saw last night?" Olaf wandered into the kitchen and rubbed himself against both of their legs. Mikael shook his head slowly. "We should," he admitted. "But nobody will believe there's a monster living beneath the lake. We are old men. They'll think we're crazy." Lars stared down into his coffee. "So what do we do then?" Mikkel looked toward the snowy window. "We kill it." Lars looked up immediately. "But it survived bullets," Lars said nervously. "A gun is the only protection I have." "Yeah," Mikkel replied. "But I've seen a lot of hunting movies. Maybe we can trap it." Mikkel walked around the table and placed a reassuring hand on Lars's shoulder. "But what do we do after we trap it?" Lars asked quietly. Mikkel slowly sat back down. "We ask your friends for ideas." Lars was not fully convinced. But deep down, he knew Mikkel was right. Because somewhere beneath the frozen lake, the creature was still waiting. When Lars and Mikkel were getting ready to leave, Lars finished packing his things while Olaf wandered around the guest bedroom. The little cat spotted a sandwich sticking halfway out of Lars's bag. Lars had packed it late the night before when he could not sleep. As Lars walked to the bathroom, Olaf quietly jumped into the bag and began eating the sandwich. A few minutes later, Lars returned and lifted the bag onto his shoulder. "I don't remember this bag being so heavy," Lars muttered to himself. Well, old man brain. Outside, Mikkel was already waiting in the car with the engine running while snow drifted across the road. Lars climbed into the passenger seat, and the two old men slowly drove away through the quiet Danish town. As they drove, Lars opened his bag to grab his phone. Instead, he found Olaf curled up inside beside a half-eaten sandwich. Lars burst out laughing. "What's so funny?" Mikkel asked while driving. "Your fat cat jumped into my bag to eat my sandwich." Olaf looked up with crumbs stuck in his white fur and continued chewing the sandwich like nothing had happened. Mikkel started laughing loudly. "That dumb cat eats everything." For the first time since seeing the creature, the two old men actually smiled. But the feeling did not last long. Soon they arrived at Casper's apartment building. The apartment was a tall, grey building with a dark red roof covered in snow. Several windows glowed warmly against the cold winter morning. They decided to leave Olaf in the car where it was warm. "Do not eat the seats while we're gone," Mikkel joked while pointing at the cat. Olaf blinked slowly in response. The two men climbed the icy stairs toward Casper's apartment. Mikkel knocked on the door. Casper opened the door almost immediately. Casper stood there wearing a thick robe over his clothes, his messy hair sticking out in every direction as if he had barely slept all night. "You actually came," Casper said nervously. Inside the apartment, newspapers, candles, and books about Scandinavian folklore covered the table. "You've been researching the Nook?" Lars asked. Casper nodded. "I barely slept." Mikkel sat down heavily in a chair. "Good," he muttered. "Because we're going to kill it." Casper stared at him. "You're serious?" "We don't have a choice anymore," Lars replied quietly. A heavy silence filled the apartment. Snow tapped softly against the windows while the old radiator hissed in the corner of the room. Casper slowly sat down across from Mikkel, still clutching his robe tightly around himself. You can't seriously think 4 old men can hunt that thing, Caspar muttered nervously. Before anyone could answer, a loud knock suddenly echoed through the apartment. Everyone froze. Mikkel slowly stood up from the chair. Another knock came from the door. Caspar carefully walked over and opened it. Emil stood in the hallway covered in snow, his thick winter coat dusted white. Behind him, Nikolai leaned weakly against the wall wrapped in blankets, still pale from fainting the night before. Nikolai finally woke up, Emil said as he stepped inside. Nikolai looked embarrassed. I haven't fallen over like that since 1987, he grumbled. You saw a monster, Lars replied quietly. I think you earned it. Mikkel helped Nikolai sit down while Emil removed his gloves and looked around at the books scattered across the apartment. So, Emil said tiredly, what's the plan? Mikkel leaned forward in his chair. We trapped the creature on the lake. Emil immediately shook his head. No, absolutely not. We don't have a choice, Lars said. Emil pointed toward the window. That thing survived bullets. I fought in a war, Lars. When something keeps moving after getting shot. Emil paused quietly. You run. The apartment became silent again. Then Caspar slowly reached toward one of the old books lying open on the table. There might be another way, he whispered. Everyone looked at him. Caspar turned the book around slowly, revealing an old drawing of a creature standing beside a frozen lake beneath a full moon. And beneath the picture, written in faded Danish words, were 3 sentences. The creature fears fire. The creature cannot cross broken ice. And once it begins hunting, it never stops. Lars, Mikkel, Caspar, Emil, and Nikolai left Caspar's apartment and carefully climbed down the icy stairs into the snowy street below. They piled into Mikkel's old car where Olaf had been left waiting. When Mikkel opened the driver's side door, he immediately burst out laughing. The others quickly walked over to see what was so funny. Olaf was lying upside down in the driver's seat with his tiny legs sticking into the air like he owned the entire car. Even Nikolai laughed a little. Emil tilted his head while staring at the cat. Why does the cat have 1 leg? He asked. Mikkel paused for a moment before shrugging. I don't know. That's how I found him. Olaf lazily blinked at them before rolling onto his side. Soon, everyone squeezed into Mikkel's old car and drove through the snowy village toward Caspar's store. Caspar's store was a strange mix of many things at once. A tiny grocery store, hardware store, fishing shop, and village market, all packed into one old building. A small bell rang above the door as they entered. Since this is an emergency, Caspar announced while locking the door behind them. Everything is free. Thank you, Caspar, Lars said sincerely. The old men quickly spread throughout the store gathering supplies. Emil headed toward the fishing section first. He grabbed hunting knives, thick rope, heavy hooks, and an old fishing rod. Caspar walked behind the cashier counter and picked up a fresh deck of playing cards. He remembered how sharp the edges of new cards could be. Then he grabbed several lanterns. Maybe fire or light scares it, he muttered. Mikkel disappeared into the food aisles before returning with canned cat food for Olaf, along with heavy chains from the hardware section. Lars grabbed a pickaxe, thick gloves, and an old hunting flare gun hanging near the camping supplies. Nikolai quietly picked up several emergency flares. Soon the counter was covered in supplies. The atmosphere inside the little store had changed completely. Yesterday, they had been old men playing cards beside a warm fire. Now they looked like hunters preparing for war. Outside, snow continued falling heavily over the tiny Danish village. The sky was already beginning to darken again. Winter nights came early. The 5 old men carried the supplies outside and packed everything carefully into Mikkel's old car. Olaf sat in the back seat licking cat food from his paw, completely unaware of the danger around them. Mikkel closed the trunk with a loud slam. "Well," he muttered while looking toward the dark, snowy road ahead. "Let's go kill a monster." Nobody laughed this time. Then the car slowly disappeared into the falling snow as they drove back toward Lars's cabin beside the frozen lake. When they got to Lars's house, there were giant webbed footprints in the snow, far too large to belong to any human. Everyone stopped walking. The footprints led from the frozen lake all the way to the cabin before disappearing back toward the trees. Nobody spoke. Even the wind seemed quieter. Finally, the old men hurried inside Lars's cabin and shut the door behind them. Lars quickly pulled out a piece of paper and began drawing a rough plan across the kitchen table. "We're gonna trap it," Lars said seriously. "Then kill it." Everyone silently agreed. Soon they carried the supplies back outside into the freezing darkness. Together, they carefully buried heavy chains beneath the snow, near the edge of the frozen lake. The chains were connected to thick ropes tied tightly around a large tree beside the shore. The plan was simple. If the creature stepped onto the hidden chains, the old men would pull the ropes tight and wrap the chains around its legs and body to stop it from escaping back beneath the ice. "It's strong in the water," Emil said while pulling the rope tighter with his gloved hands. "So we keep it out of the water." Mikkel nodded. "And if the ice breaks," he added quietly, "the chains might stop it from dragging one of us under." Nearby, Casper carefully hung lanterns around the lake while Nikolai loaded emergency flares with shaking hands. Snow continued falling harder around them. The frozen lake looked endless in the darkness. And somewhere beneath the thick black ice, something was waiting for them. After finishing the trap, the old men hurried back inside Lars's cabin to warm themselves beside the fire while snow hammered against the windows. Nobody spoke much. The tension inside the cabin felt heavier than the storm outside. Then, bang! Something slammed violently against the front door. The entire cabin shook. Another crash followed, louder this time. Bang! "The creature!" Casper shouted. Before anyone could react, the door burst inward with a loud crack. The tall creature stumbled through the doorway covered in snow and freezing lake water. Lars reacted instantly. With a roar, the old fisherman kicked the broken door forward, knocking the creature backward into the snow outside. "Now!" Lars yelled. The old men rushed outside into the freezing night. Lars charged first, gripping a hunting knife tightly in his hand. Behind him, Nikolai held the flare gun with trembling hands. Emil carried the pickaxe over his shoulder. Mikkel gripped a burning lantern. Casper nervously clutched his deck of cards. Snow whipped violently around them as Lars sprinted toward the creature with everything he had left in his aging body. But the creature was faster. Its long clawed fingers suddenly grabbed Lars by the shirt and lifted him high into the freezing air. Everyone froze. Up close, the creature looked even more horrifying, towering over Lars. Huge black eyes reflecting the firelight, pale scaled skin dripping with freezing water. Strange axolotl-like ears twitching beside its head. Thick body fat hanging from its massive frame to survive the cold. Lars struggled helplessly in the creature's grip. "Mikkel!" Emil shouted. Without hesitation, Mikkel hurled the lantern directly at the creature. Crash! The lantern exploded against its chest. Fire burst across the creature's body. At that exact moment, Lars drove the knife deep into its shoulder. The creature let out an awful scream that echoed across the frozen lake. Flames surrounded it. The old men stumbled backward through the snow while the creature thrashed wildly in the fire. Then suddenly, it stepped out of the flames. Its scales were blackened in places with small burn marks covering its body. But it was still alive. Lars went pale. Nikolai immediately fainted again and collapsed backward into the snow. Even Emil's face turned white. His mouth slowly dropped open. In all his years, even during the Vietnam War, he had never seen anything survive fire like that. Casper panicked and began throwing cards wildly at the creature, but his shaking hands ruined his aim. Every card missed and vanished into the snowstorm. Mikkel slipped and fell backward into the snow. The creature slowly looked down at the knife buried in its shoulder. Then, with terrifying calmness, it ripped the knife from its own body. Dark blood dripped onto the snow. For a brief moment, the creature stared directly at Lars. But this time, something had changed. The creature looked afraid. Slowly, it dropped the knife into the snow. Mikkel quickly grabbed the flare gun from Nikolai's limp hand and fired. Whoosh! The bright red flare shot toward the creature. The creature ducked instantly before turning and sprinting toward the frozen lake. It disappeared across the ice with unnatural speed before stopping near the dark frozen water. There, beneath the falling snow, the creature turned one final time to look back at the old men. And for the first time since they had seen it, fear was visible in its huge black eyes. Then creature jumped into the hole in the water, in the frozen lake. The old men stood silently beside Lars's cabin, while snow drifted around them. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the freezing wind blowing across the lake. Lars slowly bent down and picked up the knife the creature had dropped. Dark blood still covered the blade. Nikolai was still unconscious in the snow where he had fainted. "No," Emil muttered while staring toward the frozen lake. "It's hiding." Mikkel looked down at the burned footprints leading across the ice before disappearing into the darkness. "We heard it," he said quietly. "That thing can feel fear." Casper nervously adjusted his coat and looked toward the black hole in the frozen lake. "But what if it comes back?" Nobody answered him. Slowly, the old men carried Nikolai back inside the cabin and laid him carefully onto the couch near the fireplace. Inside, the warmth from the fire barely pushed away the cold. Olaf crawled out from beneath the table and immediately jumped into Lars's lap. The old fisherman gently scratched behind the cat's ears while staring silently out the frost-covered window. Outside, snow continued falling over the frozen lake. Hours later, Nikolai finally woke up, confused and embarrassed, while Emil helped him into the car. Soon, Emil and Nikolai drove home, while Casper returned to his apartment in town. Only Lars and Mikkel remained inside the cabin. Neither man slept. Near midnight, Lars quietly stood from his chair and walked toward the window. The storm had finally stopped. Moonlight reflected across the frozen lake like silver glass. For a moment, everything looked peaceful. Then Lars noticed something moving beneath the ice. Slowly. Deep below the frozen lake, two enormous black eyes opened in the darkness, watching the cabin, watching him. Lars froze. The creature was still alive. Then suddenly, crack! A long fracture spread across the ice toward the cabin. Olaf hissed loudly. The lantern flickered, and somewhere beneath the frozen lake, the creature screamed.